Today's video will demonstrate the stub double. Hello, I'm James Helfrich. One of the main tools we have to separate one class from another when creating a unit test is a double, and probably the most important type of double is the stub. The stub always responds with a certain fixed value, thereby guaranteeing that the subject or the class under test is not influenced by any other class. This video will define and give an example of a stub. A double stands in for a principal so the subject can be better isolated. Now, the subject is the thing we want to test, and unfortunately, this subject is related to the principal through something. Inheritance, composition, aggregation, doesn't matter. Now, what we want to do is create a double which inherits off principal, and we'll use a double instead of the principal. Now, in order to create a stub, I first have to make a dummy and then inherit the stub off of it. So the stub is a double that always provides a fixed output. Every time a method in a stub is called, the same output always results. So a stub is typically built from a dummy, ensuring that only the expected methods are called. For an example, let's say I have a class called direction, and I have an attribute, and I have a constructor, and I have a getter and a bunch of setters. Now, what I like to do is create a stub for direction. So the very first step is I have to make the methods in the direction class virtual. And this allows me to create derived classes from it. And then I'm going to create a dummy from direction, and it's going to inherit off direction, and it's going to have a default constructor, and everything else is going to assert false to make sure nothing gets called. So here's the trick. I want to create a stub from the dummy direction. And this one is going to be for the test case north. So I'm going to return the direction always north. So of course I have to create a constructor, and then every time I call get radians, I'm going to return 0.0 because that corresponds to north. Notice that if I call set radians, set north, or reverse, then my assert is going to call from my dummy. Now I'm going to create another test case called stub direction south, and this is always going to return pi, and then another one called stub direction east, which is always going to return pi over 2. Now notice I can create new stubs super quick. All I have to do is copy paste the original one and change the return value, and this allows me to generate a different stub for every test case or every unit test very quickly and efficiently. Now, how am I going to utilize this? Well, this is the method I want to test, set speed direction, and it's going to take a speed and the direction, of course, is the principal. So in the initial version of my unit test, in the setup section, I create a direction object and I set the radians to 3.14159, which is south, because my test case is 10 miles an hour south. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the direction and set radians with my stub direction south direction. Now, this only will ever return south. I don't have to call any methods in direction, and therefore none of the bugs in direction class will actually impact my unit test here for test velocity. And that's the whole goal, is I want to make sure that I'm only testing one method and one method only. I'm not going to test other methods in other classes by accident. So let's take a look at a far more complicated example. Here I have the game of chess, and the chess is going to have 64 pieces. Each piece can be a space, a pawn, a bishop, a rook, a knight, or a queen. And of course, the board is going to have a plethora of different functions that allow me to modify the board and move positions on the board and stuff like that. What I like to do is I want to focus on the knight. The knight really only has 3 methods: get letter, display, and get moves. But particularly, I want to create a unit test only on get moves. So get moves is going to depend upon board. So what I really want to do is only test get moves with my unit test. But the problem is I depend upon board. Specifically, I depend upon board's get method. Now, what I like to do is isolate the unit test so I'm only testing knight and not board. So my first step is I'm going to create a board dummy, which is going to assert every single method in the board. And then based on that, I will create the board stub, and the board stub will only implement get, and it will only return pieces in a specific board configuration I care about. Okay, let's take a look at the code and see how we can implement this. Okay, so we'll start with our board class. Now, fortunately, our board class is already prepared for doubles because all of our methods are already virtual. That's awesome. Not only that, I also have a dummy already set up for my board. And that's really easy. So basically, every time we want to create a class and we know it's going to be used as a principal, we should pretty much make a dummy for it. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to create a stub based on dummy specifically for the night. Okay, so this is the test I like to do. A night is going to be the only piece in a whole swath of empty spaces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class called test board stub and empty, and this will always return an empty space no matter what piece I ask for. Okay, I think I got it done. Let's take a look. I'm going to compile it. Build succeeded. Wonderful. Everything worked. Now I'm going to integrate this into my night unit test. Okay, so now I'm only going to use a board that can only ever have spaces in it. The night is only going to test itself and nothing extra. I'm going to call get moves, and get moves better only call the fetch method, which is going to get a given piece in a given location, and that will always return a space. Let's see if this works. Okay, I'm going to run it now. When I run it, build succeeded, everything worked. That's awesome. Okay, now I'd like to do the same thing by creating another stub, and this one is to make sure that the board is filled with enemy pieces. And now I have my board stub empty. Everyone is going to be a pawn. It's going to be an enemy pawn. No matter what I do, I'm always going to turn an enemy pawn. Now, when I integrate that, then I'm going to create an enemy board, a knight at this position, and I should be able to attack all those pawns. So it's super easy to create a new stub corresponding to specific test cases. In each one of these cases, I'm only testing the knight. I'm not testing the board. And that's the great thing about the stub. You can learn more about this in the stub section of the Unit Test 2 chapter of the Software Design textbook.